G'day and welcome back to the Sci-Fi Shed. Tonight I want to take a look at the 1972 Hugo award-winning novel, and that's Philip Jose Farmer's To Your Scattered Bodies Go. Now, a very interesting book. What Philip has done, he's taken both fictional and non-fictional characters and blended them into his narrative. And one of those characters is Sir Richard Francis Burton, who was the famous explorer who died in 1890, and he was a very polarizing and controversial figure, really. And I won't go much into that, but I think the book's done a really good job of not trying to excuse anything that Richard did in his real life, nor try to glorify him or make him something other than what he was. And he's a very interesting character, so I'll leave it at that, and I'll leave it up to you to read up on Richard Francis Burton, because he's definitely an interesting character, and I think I'm going to spend some time doing a bit of research and reading a bit more about him. So what we find is Richard, the book begins with him at his deathbed, Richard that is, and he dies and he finds himself suspended on these poles that go from infinity to infinity, and on those poles are attached countless number of humans, as far as the eye can see, stretching on to what appears to be for infinity. And then that vision sort of disappears and he finds himself fully resurrected on the banks of this river, and he's alive, he can feel his body, he's a younger version of himself, a stronger, fitter version of him, younger self, but he's still completely hairless and completely nude. And next to him he finds there's this metal plate, or grail they call it, and as he's starting to come to his senses, he looks around and realizes that there's others in a similar situation to him, just in a bit of a stupor, trying to find out exactly what's going on, or seemingly to be resurrected. And what we find is that it's indeed what's happened. So what we find is that all of humanity has been resurrected on this river world, and I call it river world because this one river snakes across the whole planet from pole to pole, and it stretches on for millions upon millions upon millions of kilometers. And so we find Richard and awakening to this weird sort of culture shock, because this is nothing like any religion talked to on earth where there's an afterlife of sorts. So, and the book does go on to say that there's, Muslim, Christians, Buddhists, all religions, every creed, from prehistoric humans all the way onto the last human on earth, plus one alien being who happened to kill all the humanity. And they're all actually portrayed across the river, and they've been sort of categorized. Well, we learned that they've been categorized and distributed into some kind of fashion. So what we find that this grail, they've learned through trial and error, they can put it into these towers that are evenly spaced along the river. They can put these grails into these towers, and food is materializes magically at certain points during the day. And part of those, part of the food that they find is rather interesting, I think, and it gives away some of the 1970s vibes, because I've got things like tobacco and a particular chewing gum that is basically a drug. It gives you some narcotic and it has different effects on different people, but it's basically a drug, and it's rather very addictive as well, we learned through the book. So the first night they all take this chewing gum, not quite really understanding what it was. They just thought it was just regular chewing gum, and anarchy just reigns supreme. Just a whole lot of stuff happens that first night because they're all under the influence of this drug, and there's murder and there's rape and there's all sorts of terrible things that happen on that very first night. And this sort of starts forming alliances between different people. And what we find is that Francis, or Richard Francis Burton, befriends this pre-Homo sapien human in a guy called Kaz. And what we learn is that Kaz can't speak a word of English. He's just this big sort of caveman looking guy. And they sort of befriend each other and form an alliance. And what we learn is that Kaz can see his eye spectrum, his visual spectrum is different to Homo sapiens, and he can see some things that the rest of Homo sapiens can't. And what they learn is that there's a particular group of people who they began to call ethicals. And the reason that is because they're trying to figure out how are we here? What's resurrected us? You know, something must have caused this, and it can't be a god because we've ruled out all other religions as not quite fitting this picture that we're in, right? So they're trying to figure it out. And what Kaz realizes is that there are certain individuals who don't have this aura or this mark on their forehead, and they capture one of these guys, and they try to get information from him, trying to make sense of what's going on here. And without giving too much away, they learn that there's basically this group of people that have manifested this world, but as they run into them from time to time, they're not, you know, they give different stories, so you never really do learn what these ethicals, as they call them, are, why they created the world, and what's the ultimate reason for it. Which is a bit of one of the downers in the book, actually, because the book is a great book, but let's talk about that a little bit later on. So what we find is that life, even in the resurrection, is not final. And what they learn is that even if you were to die in your resurrected form, which happened a lot during the first night, a lot of murders happened in that first night, you basically reappear somewhere along the river in a completely different location. It could be millions of kilometers away or miles, whichever way you like to think. And you just be resurrected again with your growl, and you continue going on. And Richard sort of takes that to his advantage, because what we find during one of his encounters with these ethicals, he has a vision of the end of the river and at some tower, and what we find is that there's some rumors that spread around as well, as people die and reincarnate and go from, you know, different parts of the river. Myths and legends start to form as well. And one of those is at the end of the river, there's this magical or massive black tower, I think it was. And Richard Burton makes that his goal. And he wants to get to this river. And what he does, without giving too much away, is he just basically kills himself over and over again to try to get to his ultimate goal. The other main protagonist in the book is no other than Hermann Göring himself, the infamous World War II war criminal, terrible person. And it's rather interesting, really, when you have the whole of humanity to pick from, why you'd pick someone like Hermann Göring. Does it make for an interesting character? Well, yes, it does. It does make for an interesting character, because Hermann Göring himself was a morphine addict, if I remember correctly. Yeah, he was a morphine addict. At least he was a drug addict of some type, and he died addicted to the drugs. And it appears that some of his past sins don't let go of him, even in the resurrection, as the book suggests. And yeah, I don't know, interesting character. I'm not quite sure if you had the whole humanity to pick from. But then I guess I wouldn't be talking about it if it wasn't such an interesting and unrealistic, not even unrealistic, such an interesting and unlikable character, right? So yeah, and what we find is that Hermann Göring is somehow linked or somehow intertwined with Burton's life, and for whatever reason they find that if one or the other dies, that they find themselves resurrected at the same spot. And this is one of the things that, you know, if we talk about what's good and what's bad about the book. So look, interesting concept with the fictional and non-fictional characters. I can understand the choice for Richard Francis Burton in a sense that he was an explorer, so we get that element of him having an explorer's spirit and wanting to travel this river to find out where he was and what he did. He was also he was proficient in multiple languages, so that really comes through in the book as well, where he can communicate with different people in different races, different generations, as he comes across them on the river world. So interesting character in Richard Francis Burton. But I don't know, when you have the whole of humanity to pick from, why you'd pick someone like Hermann Göring. I'm sure he could have picked some other drug addict. You know, I don't know. It makes an interesting book. I guess I wouldn't be talking about it if it wasn't someone like Hermann Göring. But yeah, I don't know. I don't know. That's one of the things that... And does make an interesting character in the book, don't get me wrong. It's interesting understanding him and Richard Francis Burton are intermingled and what that means, and there's a sense of mystery in the book that I think works well together. But I don't know, I just can't come warm up to someone like that. So interesting novel, interesting concept. No religion, no one on that planet expected their afterlife to look like this. Look, one of the things that sort of leaves you hanging, and I have read the follow-up book, which is The Fabulous Riverboat, which I highly recommend as well. But the book, taking the book for what it is, a single book, leaves a lot of unanswered questions. So you never really do find out, and am I going to give away spoilers here? Maybe there's a spoiler here. So maybe switch off and come back later. But you never really find out what's behind the ethicals, who they are, why they're there, why humanity's been resurrected. We don't find out if Richard Burton ever actually gets to his final destination. So I don't know, it sort of leaves you wanting more and not really getting it. But I think that is made up in the fact that the book is just brilliant. I think it's very well written, very interesting concept, interesting characters, both, and there are some alien characters in this book as well, which are rather interesting. But they don't really feature much in the book either. So, humanity basically ends with this one particular alien destroying the planet. But the book doesn't really explore that in a whole lot of detail. And nor do I think or remember reading some of the sequels to this book, whether or not that had any part to play in the river world. So look, interesting book. I do like it, and it's actually one of my favorite books. I first read this book, again, it was 20 odd years ago, and I've never forgotten To Your Scattered Bodies Go. And I've read it, the first time I read it, I just thought it was brilliant. Great idea, great concept. And I reread it again this time, and I remembered it. I remembered it. I remembered the character. I remembered Richard Francis Burton. I remembered the concept of the river world. I remember the concept of the gates and the towers along the river. I remembered key elements of the story that I don't want to give too much away on. So a very memorable book. And for that, I think when we look at the Sci-Fi Shed ladder here, we may be surprised as to where this one actually rates. So who would I recommend this book to? Would I recommend this to new science fiction readers? Yes, I would. I think it's a great introduction to science fiction. It's a really interesting concept, and I think it would appeal to a lot of people because the concept of afterlife and what that entails, I think all of us have questioned that at some point in our life. So for that, I think I'd recommend it to just about anyone who wanted to look into science fiction. If you know anything about Richard Francis Burton, you may be interested in reading this book, or maybe you may be disappointed. I don't know. I've just read a little bit about Richard Francis Burton, and it just leaves you wanting to know this guy a little bit more and what made him tick. And I think the book sort of gives you a bit of an insight into that. But very good book, highly recommended to new and veteran science fiction readers. I don't think you'd be disappointed. Very interesting book. So Philip Jose Farmer has also done a really good job of the world building in this book. And how can you go past that cover art? I mean, that's just fantastic. So yes, highly recommend the book. I'd rate it definitely an 8 or 8.5 out of 10. But let's take a look at the Sci-Fi Shed ladder and see where we'll place tonight's book. So back to the Sci-Fi Shed ladder. We have Way Station by Clifford Simak still leading the charge, followed by The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin, and then Flowers for Algernon. All of them are great books, so we're not going to go down that path again. But we've got to make another very difficult decision tonight, and that is, where does Philip Jose Farmer's To Your Scattered Bodies go? What we liked about the book. Well, the book has a very, very interesting storyline. It's a very interesting concept about the resurrection. Very mysterious. It keeps you guessing through the whole novel, and you're not quite sure what and where. And maybe that's probably to its detriment, because you never do quite find out what's happening with this river world. But that's also part of the appeal, I guess, to many. But it is a memorable book. Like I said, I first read this 25 years ago, and I've not forgotten it. And not even that. It's not so much that I haven't forgotten it, but I remember the characters, which I think is one of the strengths of writing these non-fictional characters into the narrative. So is it better than Way Station? Well, let's start from the bottom, eh? Is it better than Flowers for Algernon? It is better than the novel. Again, the short story, different story. But it is, I think, better than Flowers for Algernon. Is it better than The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin, which is another great book? And I think I would have to put it above The Left Hand of Darkness because it is memorable. Where I said last time when I reviewed The Left Hand of Darkness, I really couldn't remember much of that novel, which is definitely not the case To Your Scattered Bodies Go. I remember just about every single little thing about that book. Is it better than Way Station? Nah, I don't think so. And that's mainly because that sense of wonder you get in Way Station, I guess for me, this resurrection model doesn't fill me with a whole lot of wonder, to be honest. But it's still a brilliant book, and I would rate it just about there. Just below Way Station, just above Left Hand of Darkness. And really, the two are really good books, but I'd rate To Your Scattered Bodies Go before The Left Hand of Darkness, purely based on it's a memorable novel. At least it was for me, more so than what The Left Hand of Darkness was. So there you go. It's started to take shape. So there you go. To Your Scattered Bodies Go by Philip Jose Farmer. Do you agree? Disagree? Would you have placed it somewhere else? I'd love to hear your comments and feedback. Please do like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, post where you think this book will rank, and I'd love to hear from you. Look, yeah, thanks again for joining me. I'll see you next time in the shed.